Hello everyone, welcome into today's very special event brought to you by the Conservation Law Foundation. I'm your host, Tyler Pyburn. Today's discussion is a teach-in all about PFAS, a special programming covering PFAS, specifically in Vermont, really. Now on the program itself, we're going to be taking a closer look at action that can be taken in Vermont to put in place standards that get all these forever chemicals kind of out of our water once and for all. We've got a great panel that's going to be kind of walking through today's teach-in. We're going to be joined by Jen Duggan, the director of CLF Vermont, Shaina Kasper, Community Action Works, and Katie Pelch, the assistant professor at University of North Texas Health Science Center. So we're going to welcome all of those in. They're going to kind of walk through a wonderful presentation. We've had a chance to take a look at it, and they did just a phenomenal job on it, to say the least. But I want to remind you, for those that are watching, that if you are having any technical difficulties, you can go ahead and reach out to our events manager, Katie Ardrey. You can email her, kardrey, K-A-R-D-R-E-Y at clf.org. She's standing by to make sure that you can get up and running. Have any questions, she'll answer them for you. No problem whatsoever. And also reminding to all of you that are watching, whether you're on Facebook or on our website, chime in, be part of the conversation. We are going to have kind of a live Q&A at the tail end of the broadcast, but jump in now. Let us know what your questions are about PFAS. Now, in order to do that, if you're on our website, you'll see the chat box directly next to the video player itself. Just add your name, put in your question. We'll try to get to those, as many as we possibly can, at the end of the broadcast. Same goes for Facebook. In order to ask that question, well, just comment the way you would kind of on any Facebook video post or picture, whatever that may be. So we invite you to be kind of a part of this show and part of this teaching discussion. Now, to kind of kick things off, we're going to turn to our first guest. That is Katie Pelch. Now, Katie has been working on PFAS issues since 2016, when she helped pass first in the nation bans on PFAS in food packaging and firefighting foam in Washington State. Now, Katie works in evaluating existing and proposed PFAS drinking water regulations and is building an online interactive database of PFAS health and toxicological science to support transparent and efficient regulatory decision making. So with that in mind, Katie, I want to welcome you in. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day, especially kind of first thing in the morning, get it rolling right away. So I'll hand it over to you and kind of kick things off. Thanks, Katie.
All right. Thanks, Tyler. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this event today. PFAS are a class of synthetic man-made chemicals that confer non-stick, grease-proof, waterproof, and stain-proof properties to numerous consumer and industrial products. I've chosen a few representative products here to show you the wide variety of items in your home that likely contain one or more PFAS chemicals. PFAS can be found in everything from raincoats to food packaging, our stain-proof textiles, non-stick cookware, and even in our personal care products like dental floss and mascara. These chemicals have been entering our homes since the last World War with the promise that they will make our lives simpler and easier. Some of you may have read the book Exposure or seen the movie Dark Waters, both of which chronicle the experiences of Mr. Robert Balot, an environmental lawyer, as he goes head-to-head with DuPont, one of the makers of perfluorinated chemical called PFOA, that has been widely used in the production of non-stick coatings like the Teflon pan shown here. The book and the movie I just referred to are focused primarily on a single PFAS called PFOA, or C8, because the backbone of the chemical is a chain containing 8 carbons. Attached to the carbon are fluorine atoms, and so you might have also heard of these as perfluorochemicals or PFCs, in addition to the name we now know them as, which is PFAS. The carbon-fluorine bond that you see in these chemicals is the strongest bond in organic chemistry, which makes these chemicals extremely persistent in the environment. We currently don't have adequate technology to break down and destroy these chemicals, so their extreme persistence has also led to these chemicals being referred to as forever chemicals. Since the time that Mr. Balot first discovered this one chemical, PFOA, in Parkersburg, West Virginia in the early 2000s, we have learned that the class of PFAS chemicals may contain up to 8,000 different chemicals. There are so many, in fact, that not even the federal agencies like the EPA are able to give us an accurate reporting of how many PFAS are actually out there. Beyond being used in the numerous consumer products I showed you, PFAS have a number of other uses as well. For example, PFAS are used in firefighting foam to put out liquid flammable fires. And when they're used in this capacity, they cause widespread contamination of the soil, ground, and surface waters, some of which may be used as our drinking water sources. In addition to being persistent, PFAS are also highly mobile in the environment. This means that they can easily migrate from one place to another, rarely staying put and making their cleanup even more difficult. Widespread environmental contamination of ground and drinking water also occurs when contaminated biosolids are spread over large tracts of agricultural land as a soil amendment. Biosolids may become contaminated with PFAS when municipal wastewater treatment plants receive contaminated effluent, either from municipal sources or from industrial sources that use or make PFAS. But it's not just the surrounding waterways that become contaminated in this case. The crops can also take up PFAS from the soil and the water. So when we look at the big picture, there are numerous potential sources of exposure to PFAS, since PFAS are found in and move between the air, the soil, and the water, which is summarized here in this graphic. For example, PFAS are released into the air from manufacturing sites, and then they can settle to the ground in the surrounding waters. They can also be released from industrial sources, either to a wastewater treatment plant or directly into riverways. PFAS are also found in landfill leachate that is collected and then sent to our wastewater treatment facilities. And of course, I mentioned the use of PFAS containing firefighting foam and the spreading of biosolids that are potentially contaminated with PFAS. Ultimately, a large concern is that once in the environment, PFAS can contaminate the ground and surface waters, which then are our sources of drinking water. You may be asking yourself about now, okay, so PFAS are in everything, from my dental floss to my pans, and even potentially my drinking water. Hopefully these aren't harmful chemicals then, right? Well, we have learned a lot about PFAS since the negative health effects of PFOA first began to be questioned and investigated in the early 2000s, thanks to the work by Mr. Robert Ballot and the community in Parkersburg, West Virginia. The C8 Health Project report that resulted evaluated nearly 70,000 residents in and near Parkersburg and determined that there was a high likelihood that exposure to PFOA was associated with high cholesterol, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. Research conducted since the C8 Health Project has further revealed additional concerns, including those for the developing fetus. Two other important things to note here are, one, that at least some PFAS are bioaccumulative, meaning that levels can build up in our bodies over time because our body cannot either readily break them down or excrete them. PFOA, for example, has a half-life in our body of over 2 years, so it hangs around for a really long time. The second thing to note is that the effects on human health are supported by studies in toxicological animal research, in which these exposures are carefully controlled and the effect of the complex mixtures that we are all exposed to every day is really minimized. But again, it's not just PFOA that we are exposed to. What about the other several thousand PFAS? The truth is, we only have health and toxicological data available for a handful of PFAS. In June of 2018, the ATSDR, or the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, published this really large document summarizing what we know about the health effects that have been attributed to 10 different PFAS chemicals. And those are listed here in the left column. This is a summary of that report that was prepared by my colleague, Dr. Anna Reed at the Natural Resources Defense Council. The X's indicate that each PFAS has been associated with a particular health effect category listed across the top. We can see, for example, that PFOA is associated with impacts on the immune system, on development and reproduction, on lipid levels, on liver health, on the endocrine or hormonal system, on body weight, and on various blood parameters. What you can also see as you scan down the table is that many other PFAS are associated with these same health concerns. I also want to point out that some of the blank spaces you see here may only be blank because the research has not yet been conducted to see if that particular PFAS is associated with these specific health effects. And sadly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is 10 chemicals. And remember, I mentioned that there may be up to 8,000 different PFAS. To wrap up my time today, Tyler, I just want to say that PFAS really represent a perfect public health storm. Sorry, public health perfect storm. We know that these chemicals are ubiquitous in our environment, which makes cleanup and regulation a challenge. As our next speakers will describe, we currently do not have a regulatory framework that can adequately address all these risks that are posed by this class of chemicals. It's important, though, that we start taking action because PFAS are persistent in the environment. They move readily throughout our environment. And when we are exposed, even to very small amounts, they can build up in our bodies and cause numerous health concerns. Tyler, thanks. Back to you.
Awesome. Great stuff, Katie. Thank you so very much. Really do appreciate it. Great kind of way to kick things off and explain it. It was perfect. It really was. So kind of before we get into our next speaker, however, we do want to launch a poll. We have a question for the audience right now. So we'd love to kind of hear from you. So this question, true or false? The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has established drinking water rules for PFAS chemicals. True or false? We're going to go ahead and launch that poll right now, both on the website as well as on Facebook. So we would love it if you, of course, as you can imagine, just jump in, give us your answers. We're going to tell you true or false later on in the broadcast itself. So we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But now we're going to be joined by Shaina Kasper in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Water Program Director for Community Action Work. So those are the states that she's available in. So Shaina, thank you so much for joining us. It's the Community Action Work, so folks know, is a Northeast-wide nonprofit organization that organizes with communities on the front lines of local environmental threats. Now, she's worked on PFAS since 2016 and has co-facilitated the National PFAS Contamination Coalition for the past 3 years. Shane, I don't know how you say that 5 times fast, but I know you can. Now, she's also won a national multi-site health study, 11 state drinking water standards, and a lot more. So, Shaina, thanks so much for joining us, and I appreciate you taking time out of the day to jump on with us. So I'll kind of hand the reins over to you.
Thanks so much for having me. I'll be sharing a bit about how important community organizing is and the leadership from impacted communities. And how important those have been in dealing with PFAS. So I'll share a bit about Community Action Works and what we do and what we've been doing on PFAS for the past few years. Community Action Works, we believe that environmental threats are big, but that the power of well-organized community groups is bigger. And so that's why we work with side by side with everyday people to confront those who are polluting and harming the health of our communities. And we partner with the people who are most impacted by environmental problems, which are often Black, Indigenous, people of color, and poor communities, training them with the know-how that anyone would need to make change in their own backyard. Because we know that when neighbors know how to make change, that's how we build the power to transform our world. We know that this real lasting change takes root when people get together and take action at the local level. There are, not that many groups that come to your neighborhood and train, you and your neighbors on how to take action. And when communities know how to make local democracy work for their health and environment, you can lead the movement for large-scale transformation. So our program kind of has 3 different pieces. So first of all, can help get you organized. When community groups know how to build community power, they can confront polluters and seed solutions. We can make connections. So community groups, we know, are stronger with connections. We connect groups working on the same issues across cities or towns or state lines. We can also connect groups to legal, public health, environmental experts, like these other 2 fantastic folks on this presentation, who can work with groups to help them succeed. And then finally, we believe in building folks' ability to lead for the long run. So providing leadership trainings, we host an annual conference. We have a weekend trainings that bring together community leaders from across the region, now all happening on Zoom. And we design these trainings and gatherings to build the movement and to give community leaders, a deeper understanding of environmental and social problems, new skills, and inspiration to keep going. So kind of the core curriculum of our work are these different, trainings that we can run with groups, so everything from campaign planning to being able to interpret the test results that you might get back for your water tests or your blood tests, organizing media events, whatever a group needs in order to win on their local fight and to build the movement for large scale change. And then for the, went one too far, just overview of the different issues that we work on. We have been called Toxics Action Center for the past 33 years, but we just recently changed our name to Community Action Works because we found that people didn't know quite what we did. We do work on these classic toxic issues like PFAS, but we also work on clean energy issues, fighting fossil fuel infrastructure. We also work on pesticide issues. The only thing we intentionally release into the environment to kill living things, and a lot of waste issues as well as these kind of classic toxics issues. So with kind of all of that being said, let's jump into talking about how we got working on PFAS. So I first heard about PFAS actually on my birthday in 2016. I will always know the date. When I heard that this community in North Bennington, Vermont, had found out that their water was contaminated, was poisoned with this chemical that they had never heard of before. Their water looked and smelled and tasted fine. And to make matters worse, the manufacturing plant in town had been closed for years. And so this is a photo here of Sandy Sumner. He remembered the black smoke belching from the factory just over the hill in Bennington, but he didn't think much of it. He hadn't heard of PFOA or PFAS when state officials knocked on his home when he was working in the basement in his woodworking studio. And they said, "Hey, can we take samples of your water?" And because he happened to be home, he said, "Sure." And when the results came in and his well was over 100 times the state advisory limit for PFOA in Vermont, he didn't know what to do, but he knew he had to act. So by working together as a community with the state, we were able to pressure this responsible company to get water filters, which was then put in his basement next to his wood shop, which you can see here. So many folks in the community were sick from drinking poisoned water. And so, we were able to get this group of North Bennington neighbors together in living rooms and kitchen tables to help them figure out what they wanted to do about this problem. In Bennington, they wanted clean and safe drinking water, which included testing the drinking water of everyone who could be affected in the area, and also to get blood tests and health studies for concerned residents. So we helped them navigate these many different complicated legal options, and ultimately helped them to join a class action lawsuit to win justice for impacted families. And this photo here is of a former plant operator who had contaminated blood levels despite having clean water and being retired for decades. So the plant had been closed since 2002. And so he hadn't been exposed to PFAS since 2002 in a really, in a significant way. And there are studies showing that PFOA has a half-life in our blood of, 2 to 4 years. And his blood levels were over 300 parts per million. And so that means his occupational exposure was incredibly high, 5,000, 80,000 parts per million when he was working in this plant. And there's so many different pathways that we have to consider, including, occupational and air emissions exposures, as well as the food packaging and, food exposures that Katie was talking about, and water contamination, which is most of what I've been working out. So when we were working in Bennington, we found that PFAS weren't just a Bennington problem. This very same plant that had been operating in Bennington, when they had closed down in 2002, they didn't close up for good. They just moved their plant over to Merrimack, New Hampshire. So we started working with a group in Merrimack. And then we were getting calls from folks in Colorado and Washington and Florida and North Carolina, folks all over who were waking up to find out that the water coming out of their tap was poisonous and likely had been for years. And We now know that an estimated 110 million people living in this country are drinking PFAS contaminated water. And because of the lack of federal regulations for these chemicals, they might not even know about it yet. And it could potentially even be more than that. So in June of 2017, we co-hosted the first national PFAS conference to help lots of these different community groups from across the country to get together to get up-to-date scientific and policy information, and to meet with other community groups to be able to share their stories and experiences, and to share hope and to strategize. And folks wanted to continue working together, so they organized launching this national coalition of grassroots groups fighting PFAS contamination in their communities to be able to work together proactively for solutions. So I'll let them share a little bit more about their own goals in this video.
I didn't know what PFAS were until we found out it was in our water.
That moment changed my life.
I'm Brenda from Lawrence County, Alabama.
I'm Hope from Warminster, Pennsylvania.
I'm Lorene from Hoosick Falls, New York.
I'm Liz from Fountain, Colorado.
We are part of a national coalition
Of people who have been directly impacted, and we are demanding answers now.
PFAS are a class of chemicals
thousands of chemicals
that are linked to diseases like cancer,
Thyroid disease,
kidney disease,
Reproductive problems,
autoimmune disorders,
and they are completely unregulated by the federal government.
That means they're in my community's drinking water.
my water, my food, my body.
And in the drinking water of millions of people across the country.
Our children exposed to PFAS are getting sick.
And the government doesn't have to do anything about it.
Polluters don't have to clean it up.
So now we're taking charge.
The National PFAS Contamination Coalition envisions a PFAS-free world.
Where people are not exposed to any PFAS.
Where the environment and public health are protected.
where there's justice for the victims of PFAS exposure
And where laws and regulations change.
to prevent contamination from ever happening again.
Together, we can do this.
We need a movement of people.
Saying enough is enough.
Ya basta. Enough is enough.
Holding our government accountable for our communities.
And holding polluters responsible for cleaning up their mess.
We cannot wait any longer.
Not when it's our families.
Our neighbors,
Our kids.
Being exposed to PFAS every day.
The time for action is now.
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 Now. Now.
Now.
So thank you for hearing a little bit about this story. And so while the coalition has grown, we've won health studies and state drinking water standards, release of protected government research, and more. But there is still just so much to be done, especially right now. PFAS, suppresses the ability of the immune system to make antibodies, and part of the immune system, critically important to fighting COVID and other infection agents. And so COVID has disproportionate impacts on PFAS impacted communities. And on top of that, areas hardest hit by pollution are often Black, Indigenous, communities of color, poor communities, those hardest hit by COVID as well. So it's really just a terrifying prospect. And it's just so urgent and so vital that our policymakers do everything in their power to protect our communities from pollution. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shane. I really do appreciate it. So before we move on to our final speaker, I want to do two things. One, remind everybody to jump in and be part of the conversation. If you do have questions, go ahead and throw those into the chat box. Whether you're on our website, again, chat box directly next to the player itself, ask away. We're going to be having the live Q&A at the tail end of the program itself. And same thing for the folks that are on Facebook. You know how to comment on a video. Just do that here. Just do that now. We'll kind of bring those up live and ask that to our panel. And the next part that I wanted to go ahead and jump into right now is give the answer to the poll and that question. So you guys have it again. True or false? The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has established drinking water rules for PFAS chemicals. Correct answer is false. The majority of you got that correct. Great job. You know your stuff. we got a great audience as usual, but we do in fact want to move on, and we're going to go ahead and get to Jen Duggan. Jen's the director of CLF Vermont and has a lengthy record of holding polluters accountable and has led several successful campaigns to protect drinking water. Now, she began working to address PFAS and contamination in 2016 in her former role as general counsel of the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. So, Jen, welcome in. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Tyler. Thanks for that introduction, and good morning, everybody.
Awesome.
So you've heard from Katie and Shaina about the health and community impacts of these dangerous chemicals. They truly are a public health perfect storm. PFAS are everywhere. They make us very sick. And meanwhile, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency has dragged its feet for decades and failed to hold chemical manufacturers accountable for the harm that they've unleashed. I'm going to talk about some of the causes of the PFAS crisis and share information about what the Conservation Law Foundation is doing to protect drinking water. We'll also talk about how everyone watching today can take action right here in Vermont to get these toxic chemicals out of our water. So how have things gotten so dangerously out of control? The short answer is that our federal chemical safety and drinking water laws are broken, and gaps in these laws have allowed companies like DuPont and 3M to contaminate our drinking water and our bodies with toxic forever chemicals. Many of us take drinking water for granted, and we just expect safe and clean water when we turn on our taps. But the truth is that our laws just don't guarantee safe drinking water for many communities. I don't have enough time today to walk through all of the gaps in protection, but I do want to highlight a few that are particularly relevant to our conversation. First, most contaminants in our water are not covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Numerous studies conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey and other researchers document thousands of unregulated contaminants in our drinking water. This includes the PFAS chemicals we're talking about today, but also things like pharmaceuticals and microplastics. In fact, we've only set federal drinking water standards for about 90 chemicals. And you can see from this chart that we're barely scratching the surface. In addition to rules for about 90 contaminants, we have health advisories for about 550. But these are just guidelines, and they're not a regulatory requirement to test and clean up pollution. And even then, it just doesn't compare to the more than 68,000 chemicals in our federal chemical inventory. This is serious because where there are no drinking water rules, there's no testing, and there's no requirement to clean up pollution. We're flying blind, and these chemicals are effectively invisible to regulation. The second gap in our drinking water laws is that they rely on a flawed chemical by chemical approach. And what this means is that we review and set these standards one chemical at a time. It's incredibly time and resource intensive to set a standard for just one contaminant. It can take years and sometimes even decades. And reviewing each chemical one by one in isolation, it doesn't account for the health impacts from the cumulative exposure to the many different kinds of chemicals. In the context of PFAS, we're playing a dangerous game of whack-a-mole if we continue to chase down the more than 8,000 chemicals one by one. In addition, our federal chemical safety law, which is supposed to function as a gatekeeper to keep dangerous chemicals out of the marketplace, is also deeply flawed. The reality is that the gate is broken and it's been swinging wide open for decades. In the 1980s, more than 62,000 chemicals were grandfathered under this law, and the vast majority have never been reviewed for safety. Between 1980 and 2016, many more chemicals have been allowed into the marketplace due to weak safety review provisions. The good news is that some important improvements were made to this law in 2016 that should help going forward. But the bad news is that the amendments are just not sufficient to deal with thousands of legacy chemicals. The takeaway here is that there is a lot of bad stuff in our drinking water, including these toxic forever chemicals that we're not even testing for, much less removing from our drinking water. And when it comes to setting drinking water rules, EPA has been paralyzed. They have established no new standards since 1996. Think about that. No new drinking water rules in over 20 years. And there's no reason to expect they'll finalize drinking water rules for PFAS chemicals anytime soon. Even if they do move forward, EPA is only considering regulating PFOA and PFOS. That's just 2 out of the 8,000 chemicals in the class. Companies like DuPont and 3M are exploiting these gaps in our laws and hid information from the public about the serious health impacts of PFAS for decades, all in order to make billions of dollars in profits at our expense. If you haven't yet seen the documentary, The Devil We Know, I really encourage you to watch for the full story. Now that we have some context around the problem, I want to talk about solutions. We need to get PFAS out of the marketplace, but even if we are successful in banning all PFAS today, we'll still be dealing with these chemicals in our bodies and cleaning them up in the environment for decades. And that's why getting PFAS out of our drinking water is a top priority for CLF. We're working to put strong drinking water rules on the books that close gaps in health protections. We need rules that protect us from the entire class of PFAS chemicals. We can't afford to burn resources and time to chase these dangerous chemicals down one by one while communities are forced to drink water that has permanent health consequences. And class regulation will help us confront the fiction that we're only exposed to one contaminant at a time. Safe levels must take into account the cumulative impacts of exposure to multiple PFAS and other chemicals. About 2 years ago, CLF filed petitions in each New England state to demand these drinking water rules. Given the paralysis at the federal level, we know that states will have to take the lead to protect our water. And we are making progress. 3 states, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, now have drinking water rules in place for a handful of these chemicals. And Vermont is taking action right now to consider regulation of the PFAS class of chemicals. Vermont's the first state to consider this type of regulation, and the outcome here could help set a strong precedent for other states in New England and across the country. That's why it's so important that the public weighs in to demand strong rules. As you heard from Shaina, Vermont is not immune from PFAS contamination. The results of recent water supply testing is alarming. This testing was required as part of a new law CLF helped pass in 2019, which required most water supplies to test for 18 different kinds of PFAS. More than 100 Vermont water supplies are contaminated with PFAS, and the highest concentration was 300 times higher than what scientists suggest is safe. The formal rulemaking process to consider regulating PFAS as a class kicked off this past August, and we're working with scientists and community organizers like Katie and Shaina to make the strongest possible legal, scientific, and technical case for getting all of these dangerous chemicals out of our water. And we need your help. There are lots of ways for you to get involved and help make sure we put strong drinking water rules on the books in Vermont and throughout New England. You can sign up with CLF. We'll provide you with updates and let you know when there are opportunities for you to take action. Next week, you can participate in a virtual public hearing on October 15th. At the hearing, you can learn more about this rulemaking process and tell the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation you want to see class regulation of PFAS. You can find the meeting information at the link on the slide. You can also submit written comments to the Department of Conservation urging them to get PFAS out of our drinking water. You can email comments to Ben Montrose at vermont.gov until November 16th. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out at jduggan@clf.org. Thanks so much for your time today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Awesome. Jen, thank you so very much. Appreciate it. Great action items too for folks out there. And just to everybody knows, we are going to be sending those out, the links out, so you'll be able to see those. Take action directly right away, which is great. So now that we've kind of come to the presentation end of the show, it's time to open it up for Q&A. So again, welcome you and invite you all to kind of be part of that conversation. If you have questions, hopefully we've got answers, right? That's kind of the goal of all this. So again, put those in the chat box directly next to the player itself if you're on our website. And if you happen to be on Facebook, just below the video player itself, the same way you would on any video, live stream, whatever that may be that you're engaging with on Facebook. So with that in mind, we do have some questions that have come through, so I want to kind of jump right into it. This one, I'm going to start off with you, Katie. I'm going to bring you kind of back into the fold. This one came from Dale because you actually did mention the firefighting foam. He said, now, are there adequate substitutes for products that use PFAS, such as firefighting foam? So Katie, your thoughts from in regards to Dale's question.
Thanks. That is a great question. And there has been a lot of work in that area of research for replacing PFAS in firefighting foam and food packaging. There are now standards in place to find and use safer firefighting foams and safer food packaging. So yes, there are safe alternatives that are currently on the marketplace.
Awesome. Where is there a spot that we can go to try to find that type of list? Is there anywhere that people could kind of like look for something like that to really understand more?
There are some certification websites, and it's early here in Texas. So Clean Production Action has a great website and certification program, and so I would check out the amazing work that they have been doing to find safer alternatives.
Awesome. And again, I want to remind for Jen, Shaina, and everybody, this is open. So feel free to jump on board if you want to kind of tag on to what other people have to say. By all means, go ahead and do so, because that's kind of how we roll during the Q&A, because it's kind of like the Wild West, as if we were in Texas. So it works out good. The next question came by way of Craig. So, I know today's program is really all about water. However, he had a question, are PFAS found in food as well as water? And again, I'm kind of just going to pass this along, Shane. I'll hand this over to you, and feel free, other folks can jump in as well. Is PFAS found in food as well as water?
Yeah, I was kind of laughing, glad that Katie could come up with Clean Production Action, because I think I couldn't remember their name. They've been doing a lot of research about the PFAS in food packaging in particular, and there is a lot of work happening across the country right now on getting PFAS out of food packaging, because things like even chocolate birthday cakes, because of how they're packaged, PFAS is getting into that food. And PFAS has also been found in food in areas where where there is a lot of PFAS contamination in the water. So actually, for our right here in New England, there's been a couple of farms in Maine that have had to cull their dairy herd because the milk from these cows was so highly contaminated with PFAS. So I know the state of Vermont has also been doing a lot of research on, things like maple syrup and chicken eggs and garlic, and different products, particularly that are grown in high quantities in Bennington. But I do know that is a concern. And I'll let anyone else jump in here as well if there's anything in particular that I'm missing.
Awesome. Great. So the next
I could add that.
Go ahead. Absolutely. Jump in. Of course.
Yeah, I was just going to add, there's some interesting research for folks who want to reduce their PFAS levels, even just reducing your fast food consumption. So if you think about the fast food, it's often greasy. And so the PFAS are often used in our to-go and fast food food packaging containers. So even just reducing your fast food consumption can help reduce your PFAS levels.
Awesome. Very cool. Now, the next question kind of came from Ronald. And Ronald said, do PFAS affect us all equally, or are there communities that are disproportionately impacted? Whoever wants to jump on that one, by all means. We've kind of touched upon that a little bit, but I'd love to kind of dive deeper. Whoever wants to jump in on that, more than welcome to go ahead and do so.
Yeah, I can start there.
To that.
Or go ahead, Jen. Great.
I will start, Shaina, and then I'll hand it over to you. Access to safe and clean drinking water is absolutely a social justice issue. And PFAS is no different. And the equity issues arise in many different ways in the context of drinking water. But, polluting facilities are more likely to be located in low income and Black and Brown communities. These communities often may lack the resources to advocate and participate in decision making that impacts their drinking water. And the government response to contamination can vary depending upon which community you live in. And your ability, to have the resources to provide your own treatment or transition to a safer alternative, is also impacted. So clean drinking water is absolutely a social justice issue.
I think you, answered that perfectly. Thanks. I think the only piece that I would add is just on occupational exposures as well. I think we've been seeing a lot of firefighters because of the foams that they're interacting with at work. They also have been, and the gear that they've been wearing, also really, really high exposures. That's, I think, an emerging community that we've been seeing having really significant high exposures. In addition to the communities that live under these plants or drink contaminated water and things like that.
Interesting. The next question we had kind of come up is from Renee. It didn't kind of come up. It did come up. Renee submitted this question. Said, when did PFAS first come into our environment? Katie, I'll kind of start with you. And again, we can kind of jump around as needed. But when did PFAS first come into our environment? You don't have to give a history lesson by any stretch, but kind of when was this really kind of introduced?
There is a fantastic newspaper article that goes into this. I think it's published on Aeon. And so the fluorochemicals kind of came into the scene. I think they were starting to develop mid-90s. They really burst onto the scene around. So if we think about all those kind of vintage ads of trying to make life for the housewife easier so your eggs don't stick to your pan so that you can clean your carpets easier. So that time of kind of industrial productivity and revolution and it wasn't just PFAS, it was a lot of different chemicals that entered the marketplace around that time. Jen or Shaina, feel free to add to that.
No, I think that's right. They have been effectively invisible to regulation from the beginning up until around the early 2000s. When Rob Bilott and others, highlighted the information that DuPont and 3M had hid in terms of the health impacts of these chemicals. So even though they've been around in our environment, for decades, they really weren't discovered as a problem until the early 2000s. And even now in 2020, we still don't have strong rules on the books to protect us from these dangerous chemicals.
Katie,
it's just outrageous to me that, I'm thinking about how bonkers it is that these chemicals did not exist when my parents were born. And now they are in every red-blooded creature on this planet in their blood in some level. And so that is just, that's so messed up. And we really need to enact a precautionary approach when dealing with these chemicals.
Katie, the question I had was, you mentioned the paper. What was the name of that paper again? I just want to make sure that we get that out there for folks, because that's
I will
super
look
important.
it up and send it to you.
Awesome.
I'll find it and send it. I can't think of it off the top of my head.
It's tough when we're live. Know how it rolls, to say the least. So I think we're coming close on from a time perspective, and kind of what I would love to do is kind of closing thoughts from you and from action items. I'll start with you, Jen. You gave some great kind of takeaways and links to click and to follow up. What are the things that you would say, as soon as someone wraps up watching this, what do you want them to do? Where do you want them to go? If it's one thing, I'll kind of go around the horn for everybody, but I'll start with you, Jen.
I think the one thing would be to contact the Department of Environmental Conservation, get those written comments in to advocate for rules to get the class of PFAS chemicals out of our drinking water, and sign up for the public hearing next week.
Awesome. Shaina, what about you? What are kind of, even if it's not necessarily an action item, what's the takeaway that you hope people come away with today?
I just want to ditto everything that Jen just said. And just of understanding the power that you have and your community has. And if there is a problem that your community is facing, whether it's, clean drinking water or, housing justice, or, if there's an issue that you want to solve, that you have the power, you and your community have the power already to get together, make your voices heard, and be able to protect your community and the environment.
Awesome. Katie, closing thoughts.
Closing thoughts. I echo, of course, what Jen and Shaina said, but also we can't delay waiting any longer. So we have to make our voices heard, as Shaina said. And we can do that in a lot of ways. We can take action in our personal lives. As I mentioned, simple things like avoiding fast food, changing how we cook popcorn. Instead of using the microwave bags, we can cook it on the stovetop. We can vote essentially with our dollar. If we feel empowered, of course, we should contact not just our Department of Natural Resources and our environmental protection agencies, but also our representatives, because they speak for us as well. And we need to make sure that they hear our voices and know that this is a concern to us.
Awesome. I love it. We did have one last question actually just kind of jumped in. So before we go, talking about the environment as a whole, and I'm going to go ahead and just bring this up. So give me 1 second so we have that up for you. And this question kind of came in from Dale. Not Dale, Gail. My apologies entirely, Gail. Do PFAS affect wildlife, plants, and animals? Because that's one of the things that we've actually seen a question kind of pop up every now and again. Not just only does it how it affect people, but how does it affect kind of the greater planet, really, the wildlife itself. Katie, I'll toss it to you, and Shaina, Jen, feel free to jump on as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, yes, PFAS do affect plants and wildlife. From the plant perspective, I think we probably know more about it in terms of crop species, because that's what, as humans, we're most concerned with. But a lot of the early studies were really directed at detecting these persistent chemicals in Arctic wildlife, places where PFAS have never been used. There's no use to use them in these very remote locations, and yet there are staggering levels that we find in species such as polar bears and whales and some of our top prey species and our apex predators. So absolutely, they affect wildlife. They're detected in wildlife, and they can affect their reproduction and their ability to thrive in the environment.
Jen, Shaina, anything you wanted to add to that? I mean, I feel like every single time one of you just kind of nails it, and the other two, I just see you shaking your head. You're like, yep, that's just kind of spot on. So that was perfect. Well, I think that was a great way to kind of wrap up the show. So again, Jen, Shaina, Katie, thank you so very much for taking time out of the day to jump on today's teach-in. Really appreciate it, and great stuff. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tyler.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. All right. So with that, now there was a lot that was covered in this. We are going to be having this file on demand for you. So make sure to check back on our social channels to see where this actually is going to be living live after the show has kind of concluded as well. And obviously, big thanks to those folks that kind of came on and presented for us, but a big thank you to you as well for joining the conversation, sending in your questions, and just viewing and kind of hopefully taking action after this. So we would really love that. And one of the ways that you can take action is to follow up with some of the different things that we have on our end. You can do that by, a number of different ways. Follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn as well. But the other piece is to be signing up for our e-newsletter. You can do that by logging on to clf.org. So you stay informed kind of on all of these different topics that we're covering day in and day out. So again, thank you so much for everybody that has kind of joined us today. We'll see you next time.